Hey, did you ever read this classic novel of occult conspiracy and synchronicity? Well, here's a damn coincidence for you. The Illuminatus trilogy climaxes at the end of April as the US is under martial law because of a GMO bioweapon which has gotten loose from the lab. There's a desperate effort at contact tracing, which leads to an asymptomatic carrier named Carmel, who is self isolating for unrelated reasons, hiding in a cave near Las Vegas. And what's he doing in that cave? Eating bats. Eating bats! I shit you not. There it is on page 577 of the Dell Combined Edition. The cause of martial law in the USA is a guy eating bats. How do you like them apples? Pretty good, eh? There must still be some magic in this old sync book. Or is it possible that the silly someone ate a bat origin story of COVID 19 was promoted as an intentional callback to this book? If you had to come up with the fake cover story for where COVID came from, if you knew that your lie would be told to everybody, wouldn't you drop a wink to the initiated like this? It's really not so outlandish. I mean, how on the nose does a coincidence have to be before we consider it too good to be true? I don't know. That question is the permanent dilemma surrounding the sort of puzzling evidence that is known as predictive programming. But it's so perfectly apt that if it's not predictive programming, it's certainly an excellent example of synchronicity as opposed to mere coincidence. And as far as I know, it has not been reported anywhere else, so you're welcome, world. The most original and celebrated idea in Illuminatus is probably the fnords. The ability to see the fnords is an advanced stage of the initiation process described in the book. The fnords are printed words, the printed word fnord, which we have all been trained from a young age, hypnotized in fact, to not see. Trained with an aversion therapy, so that when we encounter the word printed in the newspaper, we not only fail to see it on the page, but we feel a twinge of anxiety, which is then associated with whatever name or idea the fnord appears next to. In this way, readers are subliminally guided to irrationally dislike certain things, but more importantly, the constant cloud of seemingly sourceless anxiety is the reason why everyone is so fucked in the head all the time. There is a splinter in our minds driving us mad. The splinter of fnords! It's a great idea, but it is our suggestion that the real fnords are in fact not words but coincidences, specifically facial resemblances between different celebrities. Resemblances which we can't help but recognize on some level, but also can't process consciously since we know too much about them, specifically that they are definitely different people. Even if we notice these resemblances, we dismiss them as coincidence. But what if they're not? Face fnords would be a much more effective trick than printed word fnords. There's no mention in Illuminatus of how fnords would work on TV news, for example, whereas if the fnords are facial resemblances, then TV is a perfect medium for them, as well as printed photos. The book describes first graders receiving the hypnotic training. Since the fnords are words, they have to wait until we can read to teach us not to see them. Whereas facial recognition is our earliest skill, our most formative literacy. You can't fail to recognize a face any more than you can choose not to read a sign when your eyes rest on it. But because you learn to recognize faces as an infant, it's much easier to repress a face that you recognize than it would be to repress a word that you read. And beyond just making people irritable, this perceptual friction would itself have a hypnotizing effect. For example, let's say you were terrified by the specter of Russian space supremacy, personified in the smiling face of Yuri Gagarin. But now that the home team is preparing to launch their triumphant response, the mission is led by a guy who looks exactly like Gagarin. And on some subconscious level, you can recognize that the guy you're rooting for to relieve your space race anxiety is the same guy onto whom you projected that anxiety in the first place. but you have no worldview with which to process that recognition consciously, well, my friend, in that condition, you might not have the mental energy available to notice the discontinuities and impossibilities of the so called moon landing. The intensity of the fnordic cognitive dissonance might be just what's needed to help people swallow that surrealist atrocity in a dreamlike manner without a twitch of doubt. Imagine what they could get away with if we were all perceptually crippled from being constantly bombarded with these face fnords. Now, Illuminatus does highlight one conspiracy theory of facial resemblance. Page 42 is where we first learn of, quote, the possibility that Adam Weishaupt killed George Washington and took his place. Whatever the reality of those two, the idea plugs perfectly into the symbolism of the two-headed eagle, which we described in our video about Crowley and Churchill. In fact, Robert Anton Wilson once said that Churchill doesn't exist. Asked by the mighty Nardwuar whether the moon landing was faked, he gives an apparently sarcastic response of wild one-upmanship, claiming World War II was some kind of dream war between Gandhi and Blavatsky. But he finishes by saying that Winston Churchill was not a real person. Joking or not, it's a curious coincidence that we agree Churchill was not what he seemed. He was like Washington to Crowley's Weishaupt, reigning as the head of the exoteric day world of Parliament, while also moonlighting as the head of the esoteric underground. But maybe their resemblance is also a coincidence? Do you know that old Ian Fleming line? Once is happenstance, twice is coincidence, 3 times is enemy action? It would really be something if there was a third example of a prominent world leader who happened to strongly resemble a contemporary occult leader. And what do you know? Indeed, there is. Another British leader, in fact. Have you ever noticed how much H.P. Blavatsky, the founder of Theosophy, looked like Queen Victoria? Blavatsky was not only an aristocrat, she was the granddaughter of a princess. And she presented herself as being an agent, directed by a shadowy, inaccessible, mysterious cabal of secret chiefs, following their instructions to be a missionary. And Blavatsky's reported lifetime fell entirely within Victoria's. Queen Victoria was mostly missing in action, unseen by the public, a hermit supposedly hiding in her palace, but who knows? The primary evidence of Victoria's day-to-day existence is a detailed diary she's said to have kept, but most of the originals were destroyed and never seen except in posthumously edited form, so who knows? She certainly didn't make a lot of public appearances like more recent royals do. Perhaps she was too busy founding a new religion in the US? Victoria herself is said to have been very interested in the occult. She and Prince Albert attended their first seance together in 1841. When he died 15 years later, she was eager to find someone who could channel him, and supposedly she did. First was a 13-year-old named Robert Lees, and then Albert's gun boy, John Brown, who became Victoria's, platonic BFF until he also died, and his diaries were also destroyed. So who knows? As Nardwuar also mentions, the city of Victoria, BC is a witchy place, certainly the occult capital of Canada, maybe even of North America. Victoria has been home to a Theosophical Society since 1895, among other things. Blavatsky spent a lot of time in India. The Victorian era featured the massive colonial project of making India's politics more British. Conversely, it was the project of Blavatsky and friends to make Anglo-religious life more Indian. Or, if you prefer, to appropriate and digest Indian spirituality into an Anglo-centric framework. The mission of Theosophy was to present exotic Eastern metaphysics as something for Anglos to aspire to understand, rather than to scorn as merely primitive. Blavatsky developed a kind of common market synthesizing the two traditions, a virtual empire on which the sun never set. That was the project that Crowley continued. Imagine a system where it's the duty of the sovereign to consolidate power on a cultural level as well as a physical level, a software level as well as a hardware level, an esoteric moon head to go with the exoteric sun head. If people are expected to be so loyal as to give their lives for the sovereign, wouldn't it help to inspire that loyalty if the sovereign commanded respect with their original and creative intellect? If they had impressive psychic talents? Could it be that recent rulers have aspired to that ancient dream of the philosopher king or philosopher queen? Or maybe it's just another coincidence that they look so much alike. Either way, you now have your HPV vaccine.